Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are all safe and warm in this crazy weather that we've had. I want to welcome you to the 2021 Committee on Transfer and Articulation Conference. My name is Brooke Lockhart. I'm the current chair of the COTA committee and this year's conference MC. We are live via WebEx meeting presenting the state of Missouri's only transfer conference. This is the first time the COTA conference has been presented virtually, and we are really excited that you and more than 250 colleagues from all over have joined us today. As we kick things off, we'd really like to know where you are joining us from. I see there are a lot of responses coming through already in the chat, but if you haven't had a chance, please let us know what institution or organization are you from. As we watch the responses roll in, maybe you'll see someone you know or maybe someone you want to connect with. As we get started, I want to give you a few reminders about how we can all get the most out of this virtual event. We ask that all participants stay muted to eliminate any background noise. We also want to see your faces. I know this is virtual, but if you have a camera, please turn it on so that you can better engage with us. All presentations will be live, so please bear with us for any technical issues that we may have. Also, the chat will be monitored for questions throughout the presentations, so please do put questions in the chat as you have them. If you enter a session and you decide it's not really the one you want to be in, please close out and head to a different session, just like you would if we were in person. All sessions will be recorded, so you will be able to access them after the conference. And don't forget to engage with us on social media throughout the day using hashtag COTA2021 or at MODHEWD. Those tags will be placed in the chat. For the past 11 months, you may have heard the phrase, in these unprecedented times, we have a unique opportunity for change and improvement. Well, this year's COTA conference is definitely one of those unique opportunities where we can showcase how we were able to improve the transfer process and better serve our students even during a challenging year. This morning's keynote speaker, Dr. Karen Archambault, will inspire you and provoke thought on how we can better serve our transfer students. But first, I want to give a shout out to all of the COTA members for their hard work this year. Dr. David Jones from Westminster College, Helen Hale from Crowder College, Caitlin Wilson from Moberly Area Community College, Roberto Cook from University of Missouri-Columbia, Cheryl Dobson from Missouri Southern State University, Dr. Gavin O'Connor from Ozarks Technical Community College, Ross Hawkins from Missouri State University, Sue Bateman from University of Missouri-St. Louis, Melanie Stegman from St. Louis Community College, and Kevin Manley from Lindenwood University. I'd like to give a special shout out to Kevin Manley for volunteering his time and talent to put together our virtual conference landing site. He went above and beyond, and we really appreciate the work that he put into making this conference a success. One of the projects the COTA committee completed in 2020 was to update the transfer and articulation guiding principles and the transfer students' rights and responsibilities. Joining us today to talk about the updates are COTA members Helen Hale and Caitlin Wilson.
Thank you, Brooke. Thanks for that warm welcome, and welcome to everybody who is here joining us from across the state. We're excited to have you. So the Transfer and Articulation Guiding Principles is a statement of best practices and transfer policies outlined by the COTA committee. The guiding principles align with the state law and policy with the goal to ensure all policies relating to transfer and articulation should be easily understood, readily available, and widely distributed to prospective and current students, faculty, and staff. The COTA committee made a number of adjustments to the guidelines to update them to current language and improve the document and readability. One addition made was that agreements between institutions should specify any time limits for degree completion for students after initial entry into a program, and any applicable course validity expiration dates. Another addition to the document is to recommend that the coordinating board for higher education should review its credit transfer policy at least every 5 years. The transfer process should be timely, efficient, predictable, and sensitive to student needs. As such, the guidelines now encourage institutions to automate transfer and articulation processes based on clearly published transfer articulation rules, and to make the results available online. We believe that the transfer process should treat both native and transfer students equitably, and that communication is key to achieving that goal. Any adjustment to an institution's transfer policy or practices should be made in consultation with all parties impacted by the change, including students and prospective students, faculty, staff, and other institutions. Lastly, the updated guideline outlines guidelines outlining practices that will ensure transfer and articulation agreements reinforce the respective mission of associate and baccalaureate institutions. So, one second. The new guidelines document is available on the conference landing site, as well as the Missouri Department of Higher Ed and Workforce Development website. And now I will turn it over to Caitlin Wilson to explain the improvements made to the Transfer Students' Rights and Responsibilities document.
Thanks, Helen. The Transfer Students' Rights and Responsibilities document was created by the COTA committee. COTA acts as an advocating body for transfer students in the state of Missouri. The document outlines the rights transfer students are entitled to, as well as the responsibilities transfer students have in order to successfully move credits earned at one institution to another. The goal of the document is to help transfer students make the most efficient use of their time, effort, and money when transferring to another institution. In addition to updating the document with the MDUD's new logo and contact information, we have also clarified the wording to become more accessible to students and their advocates. Additionally, we have updated information about Core 42. Our hope is that this document will be posted where students and staff can readily access it, and that it will lead to a more successful transfer process for all parties involved. The updated Student Rights and Responsibilities document is available on the conference landing site, as well as on the MDUD website. And now I'll turn it back over to Brooke.
Thanks, Helen and Caitlin, for sharing the improvements that we worked on this year and how we can use those documents to better serve our students. Again, you can find those updated documents on the conference landing page or on the website, and there is a link in the chat. We now have the honor of hearing from Dr. Mara Woody, Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Post-Secondary Policy. She's served in this position since July 2019 and oversees college and career readiness, academic affairs, and student success strategies. Before joining the Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development, she served as the Judicial Education Manager for the Missouri Office of State Courts Administrator, where she led judicial education efforts for court staff. Before coming to the state courts, she served in higher education for over a decade in several capacities, including international credentialing, academic affairs, lean process improvement, and updating technology in her division so processes became fully digital. Dr. Woody has an EDD in Educational Leadership and Policy from Vanderbilt University, a Master of Science in Criminal Justice from Columbia College, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Criminal Justice. During the summer of 2012, she was a fellow in the Peabody College Institute of Higher Education Management at Vanderbilt University. Please welcome Dr. Mara Woody.
Thank you, Brooke. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to apologize now. It seems that I am suffering the effects of the Arctic cold and my throat is going in and out. And so if I get raspy, I apologize. So as I stand here today in my home office doing this virtual presentation, I can't help but think about last year's COTA conference. We all sat in a big room together. We were in person. And in fact, this last week's weather would have affected our ability to attend last year's conference. We even sat together at big tables. We didn't socially distance. we didn't wear face masks, and probably none of us knew how to actually wash our hands correctly. So we can at least thank COVID for that. When we look at how much our world has changed since where we were last year at this time, this last year has certainly been an odyssey. Who's incredible, by the way, asked me to present this year. I asked her if I could talk about COVID, since I think that is the only thing I actually know anything about anymore. In fact, many of you in this meeting or on this call, in this conference, from my COVID role, which is hosting the weekly COVID meetings or managing the state Binax Now antigen testing program and answering any COVID question that comes up. And there are a lot of questions. There has been in higher education. I mean, we've had to bridge the digital divide in ways that were unknowns to us even just a year ago. We have much more concern about safety and wellness of both our employees and our students. We've had to learn how to socially distance entire campuses and how to quarantine students safely. We have a lot more online education. We have more students taking gap years. We had a lot more concerns about students transferring and what would that do to our institutions. We have an increased focus on short-term training programs that then also increase the need for stackable credentials. And we have more awareness of equity issues and student needs, and a lot of other challenges, which are just far too many to list here. But we have adapted. We have succeeded. In Missouri, no higher education institution has had to shut down this year due to COVID-19. And students have continued to learn, sometimes even in classes that were enhanced by technology, not harmed. Students are still served well in a virtual environment, and we have proven that this past year. So all of these are accomplishments in which everyone in this conference should be proud. Through the triumphs, there are still challenges. We have written in our department several white papers to capture equity issues today that have been faced both because of COVID and that had nothing to do with COVID and were long-standing long before COVID. The white paper our department is publishing this month regarding the COVID-19 impact on transfer actually finds that according to the National Student Clearinghouse, student transfer has declined this year. So what does all this mean? We get a lot of information, some of it conflicting. What do we do with it? How do we know how to move forward and what we need to do to best serve our students? What do we do with all the changes in the information that we get? We adapt, we succeed. In fact, as Brooke mentioned earlier, the presentations at this conference reflect how we are responding to COVID. I think my computer locked up, so you guys don't get, there you go. I was gonna say, you won't get the next slide. So this year, we have presentations on streamlining transfer practices and processes. We've increased awareness of and discussions around transfer student success. And we have presentations on short-term training and workforce pipelines to address workforce development needs, all in this conference this year. So we are adapting. We are succeeding. Has COVID-19 changed our worlds dramatically and probably permanently? Yes. But when we are asked, what will higher education be like post-COVID-19? My response will be, whatever we make it. It is truly an odyssey that we are embarking upon. So with that thought, I'd like to share two quotes that we received from institutions last year when we wrote our COVID after action reports. Our COVID after action reports were reports that we wrote last summer and fall to capture the institutional responses to COVID-19 as they were occurring. We surveyed institutions and wrote the reports highlighting both the challenges and successes that our institutions faced and how institutions are ensuring to their success in the future and working to make sure we're successful in the future. And I love these quotes, and these quotes have resonated with me since I heard them last year, and so I'd like to share them with you today. Sorry for the length. The first one, we want to be better prepared for the future when it comes to the needs of students. Students have many reasons for missing classes beyond pandemics. Kids that need to stay home, cars breaking down, needing to go into work, the traditional model may not be the best model for our students moving forward. A hybrid approach to our classes that combines in-person and online components may be the best move. This pandemic really made us consider these extenuating circumstances and started us down a train of thought regarding how we can be more flexible for our students in the future. And in the second quote, as a community, we realize that we are more flexible than we imagined, and we can move faster than we thought possible. Given the pace of change in higher education, this is the best lesson of all. So continue to adapt, continue to succeed, continue the Odyssey. We are bringing up the next generation of leaders who may also one day have to lead the world in similar circumstances that we are leading the world in today. And we have to make sure that they can also adapt, that they can also succeed. So the work we do is critical. It is very important. Our future depends on the work we do today to help ensure our students are successful. So keep doing what you do. The next generation will stand. Thank you for your tireless commitment and for keeping the Odyssey going. Conference. I hope it contains a lot of good information. And so as we alluded to earlier, if you are interested in reading any of our after action reports or white papers, at the links on this slide. All of these reports are very short. They range. There's a lot of information, but they are very digestible. And then I would also be remiss if I did not mention my COVID role. Excuse me. If you're interested in attending any of our weekly COVID meetings that we hold every Wednesday at noon, where we get deep into the weeds about COVID and we discuss any questions institutions have, please feel free to email me at the email address on this slide. Thank you, and I hope this is a good conference and you learn a lot of great information that you can take back to your campuses. Back to you, Brooke.
Thank you, Dr. Woody. We appreciate your leadership and we look forward to continuing to partner with you on improving processes for our transfer students. Before we move on, let's recap how today's event will go. Up next is our keynote speaker, Dr. Karen Archambault, so stay right here for that. From 10 to 10:45 and then from 11 to 11:45, we will present 3 concurrent breakout sessions. You will be able to access those sessions using the COTA conference landing website, and we will place that link in the chat. During the first round of breakout sessions, you can choose from 3 presentations: Transfer Course Equivalency Workflows, a Perceptive Content Process, the Demographic Profile of the Modern Transfer Student, Goodbye Millennials, Hello Generation Z. Then during the second round of breakout sessions, you can choose from the following presentations: Best Practices, How Statewide Initiatives Can Strengthen Institutions' Transfer Success, Building Workforce Pipelines with the Bachelor of Applied Science, and Building Connections That Transfer. Don't worry if you can't decide which one to pick. All presentations will be recorded and posted on the conference landing site and the MDHEWD website. There will not be a closing session this year, so please complete the survey that will be emailed to you after the conference. A quick recap for those who are just now joining us. Hello and welcome to 2021, A Transfer Odyssey. My name is Brooke Lockhart. I'm the current chair of the COTA committee and this year's MC. In just a few moments, we will get to hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Karen Archambault. But before we get started, a few reminders. Again, we ask all participants to stay muted to eliminate background noise, but we do want to see your faces. So if you have a camera, please turn it on. All of our presentations are live, so bear with us on any technical issues that we may experience. The chat will be monitored for questions throughout the presentations, so please utilize the chat if you have any questions for our presenters. If you enter a session and decide it's not for you, please close out and head to a different session, just like you would at the in-person conference. All sessions will be recorded and you will have access to them after the conference. And don't forget to engage with us on social media using hashtag COTA 2021 and at MODHEWD. Dr. Karen Archambault, a longtime advocate for student success, has been working in higher education for more than 2 decades and currently serves as the Vice President of Enrollment Management and Student Success at Rowan College at Burlington County in New Jersey. In this role, Dr. Archambault leads the efforts to impact student enrollment and success, including admissions, financial aid, registration, athletics, student life and activities, and the college's retention efforts, including programs for honor students, low-income students, military and veteran students, and students with disabilities. A historian by training, Dr. Archambault teaches history of higher education at the graduate level with a focus on historical equity in higher education and writes on transfer students, first-year advising, and cultural competence for advisors. She has been an author on 7 book chapters on these and related topics and is the co-editor of an upcoming text on advisor training and development. Professional points of pride include the development of the LGBTQ Ally Program at Brookdale Community College, receipt of the Barbara K. Townsend Award for the National Institute for Transfer Students for her dissertation on transfer student preparedness, and launching the Task Force on Race, Ethnicity, and Inclusion, now called the Race, Ethnicity, and Inclusion Work Group, during her NACADA presidency. This work led to her receipt of the association's 2020 Leading Light Award. She has also led Rowan College at Burlington County's Enrollment Management and Student Success Division to several successful grant submissions at the state and federal level that support student success initiatives, including the recent award of a $2.3 million Title III grant. Without further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Karen Archambault.
Thanks so much, Brooke. And thanks so much to all of you for joining me in what proves to be, or what promises to be, a phenomenal conference. I'm truly honored to be here and to be able to experience the amazing work being done across the state with and on behalf of transfer students. So thank you to the committee for inviting me and to all of you for being engaged in this incredibly important work. I should warn, as I've mentioned to the committee, that I have learned over the past year that sharing anything on WebEx is my COVID kryptonite. And so if I have errors in moving back and forth across my own presentation, I'm going to blame COVID for it. So let's see. There we go. So before I get started with my actual remarks, I wanted to frame the talk with a little bit of an agenda, just so that everyone on the call knows where we're headed. So I'll tell you a bit about myself and why I'm here, because I think it's important for you to know where I come from, to know where I'd like to take us in this talk. We'll talk a bit about transfer broadly, as well as the impact of COVID on community colleges specifically, where the students on a planned transfer path usually begin. We'll then dive into the realities of what transfer looks like in a COVID world and consider what some of the longer term impacts of COVID might be, as well as consider some good practice, regardless of whether or not we're facing a pandemic. So you might wonder why a vice president from a community college in New Jersey is your keynote speaker today. And so I figured it might make some sense to ground my talk in who I am, since transfer is a key part of that story. A little more than 20 years ago, I was leaving a doctoral program in history a year in. And to be honest, I was leaving the program knowing that it wasn't the right place for me, but not really having any idea at all of what the right place was. So I started applying for jobs working with college-age students, mainly because someone who had seen me teach in my graduate program said that I seemed to show some promise in that area. And so I landed one as a transfer admissions counselor at a small women's college in Washington, D.C. I was to be responsible primarily for recruiting from the surrounding area's community colleges. I honestly do not know what they thought I was bringing to the table. I wasn't a transfer student, and I don't know if I had ever actually been on the campus of a community college prior to my first transfer fair visit. But I needed a job, and they were crazy enough to hire me. Pretty soon, though, I started seeing all the ways that these students, who quickly became my students, were not having the same college search and college going experience that I, from my naive, suburban, middle-class background, thought was standard. Their choices were often more limited. They were limited by geography, by finances, by academics, by family, or by some combination of those and other factors. Their experiences were far more complicated than my own, as they tried to make sure that the time that they had spent so far had been worth it. And for me, despite the fact that I had no personal experience that matched theirs and that I had a lot to learn, they quickly became my life's work. So for the first 6 years of my career, I worked exclusively at senior institutions, shepherding students into their baccalaureate degree programs. But for the last decade and a half, I've been on the other side of the vertical transfer, supporting students as they prepare to transfer. I've studied the psychosocial preparation for transfer, how faculty at the community college talk about transfer with their students, and I'm currently researching advisor perceptions of transfer students, both at sending and receiving institutions. All this to say that I think about transfer a lot. Mainly, I think about the transfer student's experience and how we can improve that experience. So, what is this transfer thing that we are all talking about? Before we can go much further, we need to make sure that when we talk about transfer, we're all talking about the same thing. Many years ago at a different conference focused on transfer, I heard a speaker say that we all knew that transfer, and this is a quote, is the movement of credits. Sitting in the back of the room, I felt my back straighten up, and I felt myself getting ready for a fight with this person who I had never met before. On behalf of my students, I stand in direct opposition to that framework. And I've built my work around the very simple concept that we're not really talking about transfer, but about transferring, the experience of the people who will be doing the action. And so while I'll be talking primarily about vertical transfer, the move from the community college to the senior institution, many of the same factors impact transfer more broadly. We all know, though, transfer is at least partially about credits. And a good articulation agreement written with students at the center, instead of written from the experience of the institution, can be a huge help toward a positive transfer. But if transfer is about people and their experiences, then that shifts the mindset of everyone involved. So imagine with me a student. I'll call her Liz. Liz is trying to navigate an articulation agreement. Liz is a typical community college student in that she's working 30 hours a week. She has a family to help and support. She's taking 12 credits most semesters, but she also has to stop out one spring. She takes only 9 credits the following fall. Also typical of community college students, Liz didn't know what she wanted to do until she was in her second year at the institution. And in fact, her first year is filled with good efforts in what would become the wrong classes. When Liz looks at a 2+2 plan for articulation, what she sees is all the ways that she does not fit in with the model that she's supposed to follow. She's already in her third year of a 2-year degree, with at least another semester to go and quite a few more courses to take. For her, the well-written articulation agreement can actually be more discouraging than encouraging. For her, she needs the support and guidance of the people who knew the intentions of the agreement, rather than just the words on the paper. Done well, though, transfer can be the most supportive experience that a college student can have. with the right supports, Liz can feel like every course put her on the right path, going in the right direction. And maybe even more importantly, transfer done well can be an equity effort. After all, 41% of all undergraduate students attend a community college, including 42% of Black students, 52% of Hispanic students, and 57% of Native American students. Of the approximately 4,300 degree-granting post-secondary institutions in the U.S., about a quarter of them are community colleges, but a third of Pell dollars go to the sector, meaning that these schools are disproportionately serving low-income students. Improving the educational outcomes, then, of Black, Hispanic, Native American, and low-income students depends upon effective transfer, done in a way that centers the student rather than their credits. So unfortunately, the last year has thrown everything we knew about just about everything for a loop. And while it remains true that the path for success runs through effective transfer, and that the community colleges and transfer pipeline create a necessary path to educational equity, that pipeline has been hit hard by COVID. Community college enrollments are suffering badly. Nationally, they're down over 10%, according to the final report on fall numbers from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. Community college freshman enrollment is down even more. So students who were already on a solid path may have stayed, but unemployment and uncertainty made starting a new path that much more challenging. Enrollment of underrepresented minorities has taken an especially hard hit. It's down nearly 30%, creating a particular challenge for the support of equity. After all, if students don't get started on their path, they can't possibly complete it. Certainly, as all of us experience this conference virtually, it is obvious that the experience of COVID hasn't yet passed. And we don't know what the long-term influence will be. In fact, national data for this upcoming year doesn't look promising. FAFSA submissions are down almost 10%, suggesting that those who need financial support to attend college may be looking to opt out yet again. But even if it were to end tomorrow, the impact of COVID is significant. I'd like to share a few possibilities of what this COVID experience has meant for our students at our community colleges, even in the very best of circumstances. First, the students enrolled during COVID face a lost experience. They haven't wandered the campus. They haven't randomly connected with a peer or a faculty member face-to-face, or truth be told, if they did run into a faculty member or a peer in the grocery store, they may not have recognized them purely by the nature of face masks everywhere. They haven't participated in face-to-face tutoring or a student life event. They haven't settled into a student lounge and seen the experience of other students. So even those with no other challenges to their college experience, even for those, I should say, with no other challenges, this disconnect makes it that much more difficult for students to prepare for their future. Some might say that this is true of all college students, learning in their homes rather than their classrooms. But for community college students who have a relatively short period to get on track toward transfer and enter their collegiate experience, often with multiple challenges placed in their way by society at large, the experience of being disconnected is even more profound. Second, students, when they do attend, are more likely to go part-time rather than to be able to go full-time. If you think back to the example I gave earlier of Liz, the student who was largely, but not entirely full-time, imagine how things would change for her in this age of COVID. Perhaps instead of 12 credits this semester, she takes 9, feeling that this is what she can handle, given everything else going on around her. Without a doubt, this will extend the time it takes her to get to her degree, putting her in school and out of the professional workforce for longer. But maybe more importantly, it also extends the amount of time in which something can get in the way of her continued education. While certainly any number of significant life changes could happen in a 2-year period, it is more likely that she will experience something that delays her education with every extension of that time period. But as we all know, delayed education is still education. More crucial during this time is the potential that students may just opt out. I'm going to apologize, my screen is not advancing. There we go. For many low-income and undergraduate students especially, their experience in society and in education has suggested that they are not wanted or welcomed in higher education. The challenges presented by COVID may simply reinforce the belief that education is not for them, driving them further away from education entirely. The loss for opting out goes far beyond the impact to the specific student. Our institutions are less rich when we lose the students who bring diversity to our collective table. But when students face job loss for themselves or their families, are making ends meet by accessing food pantries or other social service resources, and are increasing their anxiety due to the unknown, opting out of education seems like a perfectly reasonable decision. Even for those who participate fully, though, education during COVID looks dramatically different than in any other year. Our students may have been virtual for the first time, or learning from faculty who are teaching online for the first time. One of my institution's faculty members, who I've observed in the classroom and in his interaction with students, and I know to be an excellent instructor, commented to me over the summer that in March 2020, in the sudden switch to online, was the first time he had taught in a virtual environment. So he hadn't gone through the college's otherwise mandatory course to teach online. He was just thrown into it, like many of our students were. Even the best and most resilient students and faculty have had to pivot constantly in the past year, making education that much more difficult. So all that to say that our students, but especially community college students, who are so often the most vulnerable, have faced significant challenges this past year. But we're here to talk about transfer, so let's talk a bit about how COVID impacts transfer specifically. First, there are logistical challenges that may face our students next year or in 2022, or even many years from now. They're the results of the COVID experience I just described, but with unknown impacts. For example, imagine another student, I'll call him Joey, student who has a perfect 4.0 until COVID. Fearful of what a B or C grade would do to his otherwise perfect GPA, Joey takes advantage of his college's offer to allow pass grades during 2 terms in the 2020 year. But when he begins to look at options for transfer, he learns that some schools won't accept those pass grades for transfer credits. He learns that his options are to retake the classes at his current institution, which might create challenges for him for financial aid, or to retake them after he transfers, delaying his time to degree and costing him more money. Neither of these options demonstrate support for Joey's transfer experience or the challenges brought on by COVID. Similarly, students who have completed courses during COVID may have the grades, but not the skills in prerequisite courses. Consider Toya, who was well on her way to a transfer for her biology degree when her courses quickly moved online. She received the needed grades, but as she transferred and needed to apply the skills in higher level science courses, she learned that the grades themselves were not enough if she did not have the prerequisite knowledge to back them up. Unlike Joey, who will learn about the inherent challenges COVID has created at the point of a transfer evaluation, Toya might not learn for another semester or two, or even a year or more, that her academic experience left some information untaught, or at least unlearned. Both of these students will have new barriers in the way of their effective transfer, and the institutions they enter may or may not be prepared to support them. In addition, the process of finding a new institution may be impacted as well. For some students, the college search simply will have to be more limited because the funds to find the right institution and to visit a new campus will not be available. For others, having lost the concept of a college experience at the community college, they might simply not know what they're looking for. How can these students find an institution that will be a good match for their skills, abilities, and interests if they're trying to experience it only through a screen? How will they know whether the facilities will meet their needs if they can't experience them firsthand? While many students enter the community college knowing what school they plan to transfer to, and often focusing on the closest public school, they cannot know whether this institution will be a good fit if their ability to experience it is limited. And moreover, they may not experience it for a semester or longer if the institution of their choice remains remote. For a freshman entering college, the idea of being remote for a year is bad enough, but at least they have 3 more years to look forward to. For a student transferring as a junior or even a senior at the most generous of institutions, it is conceivable that they will transfer to an institution and never set foot on its campus, not because they want to earn their degree remotely, because their choices may be limited. The limited time available to transfer students to experience the institution from which they receive their degrees is even more crucial for students who are looking for experiences like undergraduate research or faculty mentoring. How would a student who transfers in as a junior and never sets foot on what is a tight-knit campus possibly connect to a faculty member to get a space in a lab or a letter of recommendation for an elite graduate program or a high-value scholarship? So those are some of the logistical challenges. Emotionally, though, the impact is more significant. For our students who have been financially impacted by COVID through the loss of a job permanently, personally, or that of a family member, COVID may mean delaying transfer, remaining at the community college for longer, or simply stopping out. This doesn't mean that the student's dreams are diminished. This may not be a student who has been looking for a reason to believe that college isn't for them, but may instead be a student who is striving for greatness, only to fall a bit short through no fault of their own. Transfer students, as a whole, show some of the greatest promise available to move students out of poverty, and have also demonstrated that they are survivors. While a fall 2020 study showed, for example, that 70% of California community college students neither graduate nor transfer, the transfer students who do are the survivors, So it's that much more essential that we find ways to support them, especially when their dreams are delayed. When we consider that the impact of COVID has overwhelmingly impacted students who are from low-income families and communities and from underrepresented racial groups, this is the impact that we see. But that's the immediate impact. So what does it look like in the future? The truth is, we have no idea what the future will hold when it comes to transfer after the age of COVID. There are some interesting and possibly contradictory possibilities. For example, we see that the pipeline through the community college may be slowed as a result of the decreased enrollment since this crisis began. Like any competitive market, this may put students in a new position as compared to where they used to be. No longer forgotten, they may be able to decide between multiple opportunities. But that's the impact in the next 3 or 4 years. What if, just maybe, the students who delayed their initial enrollment in 2020 or 2021 come back? If they enter the community college in 2022 and take 3 or 4 years to transfer, the senior institutions could experience an unexpected flood in 2026. In addition, students' limited finances may change what schools they consider, and their changing family experience may change where they look and what they look for. We obviously can't predict what the students currently in middle school or early high school years will feel a few years from now. But if their path is through the community college, we may find ourselves with a whole generation of transfer students who feel quite differently than their predecessors about distance education and education in general. Institutions must begin to think about how they bring new students back to their campuses, especially transfer students who will have limited time to spend connected to the institution. If we believe, as I do, that happy applicants make happy students who make happy alumni, it behooves the institution to think about how their applications, their application processes, and their orientations will set students up for success. So that brings us to our final question of the morning, and one that I know will continue to be asked and answered throughout the rest of the conference today. What is good practice that sets transfer students up for success? As I mentioned earlier, this good practice does make a couple of positive assumptions about transfer and transferring. First, we make the assumption that academic ability or lack thereof is rarely the only reason why students didn't choose to enter the senior institution directly. Second, we make the assumption that students want to be successful. And third, we make the assumption that it is in everyone's best interest that the student is supported in that success. When we take those assumptions as facts, we reposition transfer as less about the individual student alone and more about the ways in which the institution supports students more broadly toward success. If transfer is about access, we stop positioning orientation for transfers as a light version of what is offered for freshmen, and instead think of it as an orientation to this particular college for those who've already shown the ability for college success. If we think about transfer as access, we review policies that limit participation in a wide variety of extracurricular and co-curricular programs to those with years of experience at the college, such as those that require X number of institutional credits in order to apply for research, leadership positions, or other options for involvement. If we think about transfer as access, we encourage all those who come into contact with transferring and transferred students to think about the language they use with regard to new students and to the experiences that students bring to the table. Essentially, we redesign our campus cultures to assume that transfers will be plentiful rather than the exception. When we do so, many of the challenges presented by COVID, including the disconnects of so much of the past year, become less challenging and our campuses become more welcoming. As I mentioned earlier, transfer also has significant potential to be a tool for equity, including equity for those who are underrepresented on our campuses, as well as for economic equity. If transfer is about equity, we think about resource allocation in a way that doesn't assume that scholarships can be less than, because transfer students have already saved money in their first 2 years. If we think about transfer as equity, we think about leadership for and among transfer students. As Daniel Solorzano references in his foreword to the recent text, Power to the Transfer, Critical Race Theory and a Transfer Receptive Culture, the community college is, quote, the last and only chance for underserved students to make their way to four-year colleges and universities, end quote. As that text suggests, it is only when transfer is an institutional priority and not an afterthought that financial and academic support is available, and when community and family support are inherent to the transfer experience, welcoming students of color as full and genuine members of the campus community, rather than as notable exceptions to white majority campuses. If transfer students are the method by which institutions, whether intentionally or unintentionally, diversify their campuses, then an institution that minimizes transfer students or expects them to fit in to a campus culture is specifically and directly minimizing the voices of their most diverse students. If each of the programs for transfer students are just minimized versions of the ones for freshmen, then the support for Black, Hispanic, and other underrepresented students is inherently a minimized version of what is available for the predominantly white freshman class. We have essentially reached a time of reckoning, and for transfer students, that is an exceptionally great place to be. The transfer student experience often highlights the things we do really well as institutions and where we genuinely struggle. During COVID, the transfer student preparation experience and the integration of these students highlights the struggles that students more broadly have faced, and with the potential outcome that students simply won't transfer. The transfer experience of students of color highlights the experience of these students more broadly. And so recognizing these as critical issues faced by our campuses, I encourage you to spend the rest of the day today thinking not only about the specific intents of the presenters, but also the impact of those presentations on students who have faced a pandemic, who have opted out because of that pandemic, and for whom programs and practices were not designed, including those who remain unseen or marginalized on our campuses. This conference, I'd argue, has the potential to recenter institutional thinking, with transfer students positioned equally with other students the institution serves. With these students in mind and centered, we have the new potential of moving our institutions further to advance transfer and support our students. Thank you. Brooke, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Archambault, for your inspiring remarks. Your message was really great this morning, and I think this is a group that really appreciates your input. And we did receive some questions in the chat, so we do have about 20 minutes or so, and if you have questions, please keep putting them in the chat, but I will go ahead and just start. So the first question that we received is, what kinds of professional development opportunities are out there to train faculty, administrators, and staff on how to best serve transfer students, and maybe what are some of those opportunities that you've taken advantage of in your career?
So I think it's one of the things I didn't mention at the top of this in terms of introduction is how I became connected with this specific conference, and it's actually through a shared professional development background with one of the members of the committee, and that is through COTA, which is the Academic Advising Association, the Global Academic Advising Association. That has been my professional home, but in particular, that organization and many others have what are essentially subdivisions that specifically speak to transfer. I would also look at a ton of resources that have come out of the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students, which is based out of Georgia. They have phenomenal information available on their website. They do have national conferences, which are happening virtually this year, but great research that's being done out of there. I would also very strongly recommend that institutions and transfer advocates on transfer, that they look internally at not just who are their students, but what do the students of their largest feeder institutions look like, and try to get a sense of those demographics and really think about the differences between the demographics of those institutions and the ones that they are actually working in. So if you look at that institution that is feeding to you and you say, what do we need to know about these students? And certainly not just demographics, but speaking to the faculty. Faculty partnerships are some of the best professional development that folks on both sides of that transfer can have, purely because they're hearing from someone who they understand the same academic world, but they're working with very different students. Finally, I would say that there's the collaboration within an institution, as well as the more formal professional development opportunities that show just as much promise, which I would suggest, honestly, that institutions look at who they might recognize on their campus as transfer advocates, many of whom are on this call today, and think about how you all, as the advocates on your campuses, can get in front of your larger audience. So are there opportunities within your governance system, within your, whether you're, you have a professional association, a staff association on your campus, a faculty association, and how you might get in front of those groups to really share the information that you're learning at a conference like this.
Thank you. Next question, you had mentioned articulation agreements can sometimes intimidate students.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have ways that you could suggest that we can improve that, or any suggestions that we can look at with relation to that?
Sure. So I think there are a few things. One is in the visual. So when you present something as defined as a 4-semester plan on each side of that transfer, the student can immediately say, well, that's not for me. But if you present it in multiple ways, and I can see in the chat, there's a question about how can 2+2 plans are good for some people and bad for others. Some of that is about how do different students need a different visual of the same information. For some students, a checklist of the courses they need to take, where they can say, oh, look at that, I'm 3/4 of the way through this list of courses. That can often be more effective for a part-time student than that planned out semester by semester plan. The other thing that institutions can do if they have a rich enough summer schedule is to think about how you plan out a full-time version of this. If you're going full-time, this is what it looks like. But if you're going part-time, this is how you escalate your speed up, I should say, your path to degree by using the shorter term summer things like that, where you can say to a student, it's okay if you're only taking 6 credits a semester. This is still doable, and here's how a student like you does it. I think there's also a piece, though, of being honest with students. Some of the institutions local to me are very transfer friendly, but academically, they are designed for full-time students. That's not a bad thing. That's perfectly fine if that's who your institution is. But you have to be honest with the student up front about what that looks like, and not hide it, and not say to students, it's okay to go part-time. We welcome part-time students. But by the way, when you get to your senior year, you have to be taking 18 credits a semester, because that's unfair to that student who is entering knowing that they have all those other obligations. So I think a lot of it is in the visual. A lot of it is in how do you recognize that your students need information presented differently because of their different circumstances. And I will always advocate for strong advising systems where an advisor has time to talk to a student about what their plan looks like. So does that student need a full-time plan? Does that student need a part-time plan? Does that student, excuse me, does that student have the availability of having certain times of the year when they can pick something up, and really having the ability to design a customized plan that uses that articulation agreement as a backdrop rather than as the one and only thing that a student sees.
Thank you. How do we build communities on campus or virtually for transfer students, particularly those who are from historically underrepresented populations?
So this is something I've actually been challenged by personally for a long time, because it's the framework of, when do you stop calling someone a transfer student? You know, when do they not want to be a transfer student anymore and they just want to be a student at your institution? And so I think a lot about how much do you isolate, and I don't mean that in a bad way, isolate those students to encourage them to find each other, and how do you welcome those students in a way that says you don't need to be isolated, you are part of our community. So it's something that I've sort of struggled with in terms of how to do it right. But there are certain things that I would say I would, and I hate to take a negative approach to it, but certain things I would avoid. One of the things I would avoid is, don't assume that your transfer students are all going to identify as adult and commuters. That's a grouping I've seen frequently on campuses, which is the organization or the lounge for adult, commuting, and transfer students, as if transfer students inherently are going to be the non-traditional student. That's one that I think is problematic. I also think, though, that there is the space of how do you create meaningful relationships through meaningful orientation programs that are about community building and not just about content. I think to a great extent, it's the same practices that folks are using for building community more broadly, but specifically at the front end, targeting students and saying, right now, as you enter this institution, you are a transfer student. Here's a bunch of students all going through the same experience as you are, and then allowing them to sort of drop off when they're done with that, hopefully having made at least a few meaningful relationships along the way. There used to be conversation. I'm gonna diverge a little bit from the question, but I think it's important. The primary conversation around transfer used to be around the framework of transfer shock. In their first semester, every transfer student's GPA falls off, transfer students have problems, all of that language. And then folks started to ask the question, well, but does that actually continue being a problem? Or is that just an impact of the transfer itself? And what I found through research is that just as prevalent as transfer shock is transfer rebound, which is in their second semester and beyond. Transfer students often perform better than their native peers. So if I was to put an effort on community building, on transfer students, on helping faculty and staff understand those students, just as most folks would tell you, you front load resources for freshmen, you also front load resources for transfer students, because it's in that first semester that they are most struggling with transition and they find their way to settle in. The one benefit about working with students who have had so many obstacles in their way is that they are remarkably resilient. The students who are making their way to transfer are very much the survivors of the community college. Community colleges are challenged by a number of ways in how we measure numbers. How do we measure success when many students didn't intend to get a degree? But the transfer students are they're the ones that deserve the medal. They are absolutely victorious in making their way through their transfer. And I think a lot of that around beyond the questions of programming, a lot of that is in the question of how do you recognize and honor your transfer students? How do you welcome them? How do you value them? And not just in the framework of being supportive of the challenges, but saying you are amazing. You bring so much to our campuses. I used to always, when I would talk about transfer, I used to always show a picture of President Obama, and I would frame it in the concept that from an educational perspective, from an educational statistics perspective, President Obama was deemed a transfer failure because he did not graduate from his first institution, so they did not get to count him. And because he transferred into his second institution, they didn't get to count him as a graduate for statistical purposes either. And I think that's something that organizationally, institutionally, we still have to figure out how to honor the students who don't show up in our stats. How do we, at graduation, community college graduation, how do the biggest receiving institutions, how do they recognize the graduates then? We're so glad you graduated from community college X and are coming to us next year. So I think there's a lot of ways to honor and recognize. And I see in the chat there's some conversation about a monthly Zoom kind of thing about professional development. And I think certainly sharing ideas across campuses is incredibly valuable. I would strongly encourage folks to not only think about the supporting piece, but also the honoring and recognizing piece of working with our transfers.
Thank you. What ideas are there or supports to help students get official transcripts to continue enrollment at the receiving institution? This can be a challenge for many students because most colleges, receiving institutions require an official transcript. And if the student, can't access those, it can cause stop out and other challenges. So do you have any ideas or suggestions on just things that the receiving institution can do to assist them in this way?
I think there are a few things. One is to make sure that your credit receipt is standardized so that individual, and what I mean by that is really that there's technology to support it. So that if you have a team of people who look at transcript evaluations, they are not looking at each one individually for each course, that they are looking at this course is always this. This course is always that. And I know you all in Missouri have done a much better job, quite honestly, with that than we have in my home state. But really thinking about as a receiving institution, the question of why is it that your official transcript is necessary at the point where you've identified it as necessary? Is that an arbitrary barrier? And also asking the question, why is it that students are having trouble getting their official transcript? Is it financial? Is it the question of remaining financial balances at the sending institution? In which case, that's information that students need to understand before they start the transfer process. If you can't get your official transcript because of a debt to your old college, you shouldn't be starting this process right now. Let us help you through the process of getting there to pay off your old balance. But in terms of getting the official transcript, I think the first question that I always have is the timeline essential or is it arbitrary? Is it in the second semester, second term, because somebody decided it was? Or is there something that happens in that second term that makes that official transcript necessary? Are there appropriate exceptions? Are you seeing students in certain categories where that getting that official transcript is a problem? Or is it just a matter of the timing of things that, students haven't completed their coursework in time to get their official transcript with all their grades posted? And I think it really depends on institution to institution. But the first thing I always look for when it comes to policy broadly is always going to be, why do I want so many exceptions to this policy? If I'm finding that a policy needs a large number of exceptions, then I have to question why that policy exists in the first place and whether that policy is in fact arbitrary.
Thank you. What tends to be the #1 stumbling block for transfers? There's probably more than one, but in your opinion, what do you think kind of stands out?
So, as I mentioned early on, I've been doing some research on the perceptions of advisors, both at community colleges and at receiving institutions about transfer students. And I did this, I used the same survey back in 2012 and then again in the beginning of 2020, pre-COVID 2020. And what was fascinating to me is that the data held true over that extended period of time. Advisors at community colleges say that students are incredibly well prepared academically, but they are incredibly unprepared from a psychosocial perspective. They are unprepared to be part of a community, but academically there's no problem. Receiving institutions, the advisors at receiving institutions, overwhelmingly say students have no problems from a psychosocial perspective. They are completely prepared to be members of a community, but academically they are underprepared. And that to me is the disconnect, where if those who are sending their students believe that they are academically prepared and those who are working with them on the receiving end say there are academic disconnects, that to me is the stumbling block. It's not in the student, it's in the process that says, we know that there's a disconnect here, but we are not fixing it. It's the question of, it can go down to a very, very micro kind of level with course requirements. If in order to seemingly benefit transfer students, a course was deemed to be equivalent because it hit 8 out of the 10 learning outcomes were, 8 of the 10 learning outcomes were identical, but the 9th and 10th were the ones that are most important for the next course. That's the first one taken at the senior institution, then that is a stumbling block that the student has no way of anticipating. And so in my mind, it is, I take the word of advisors in particular in understanding what their students are looking at. But I think when I look at it and I say community college advisors are very concerned about the ability of students to navigate the geography and the sort of social environment of their transfer. That's why I emphasize the attention up front to having students feel part of a community. But then when the students are on the senior institution's campus, the emphasis needs to be in identifying where are the academic gaps that may need to be filled by something other than straight academic credit. For example, if it is identified that, as I used in that sort of arbitrary example of there are 2 learning outcomes that aren't covered at Community College X, then there may need to be a special transitional workshop or transitional tutoring that focuses specifically on, if you took this here, you've got the credit, but you're missing this content. And in order to be successful in this course, we're gonna prep you for that. So that's the piece that tends to be, when I think about the stumbling block, it's that disconnect for what do we need to prepare our students for versus what do we see when students actually show up on our campus.
All right, we're getting close to time, so I think I'll throw one more question your way, and then we will take a quick break. I know we don't know what the future holds, but how do you see the future of transfer?
I mean, I'm an optimist by nature, despite the fact that I spent, 30 minutes of my 35 minutes talking about doom and gloom. I am an optimist by nature, and I think that there is, there's a growing emphasis on the way that community college students in particular get counted, and the way that community college students need to be recognized for who they are. IPEDS was mentioned earlier, and the question of, how do you count the community college student? And I think that there's a lot of promise in that in terms of how we think about our transfer students. And I think when you look at things like, from the community college side, things like the voluntary framework for accountability, and things like that, that really emphasize and understand where community college students are coming from, I think the future of transfer is incredibly bright. And again, I think if there's an ability to really center the experience of transfer as an equity issue, as it's not just about that individual student, it's about the simple fact that our community colleges are the place where low-income students go. They are the place where underrepresented or unrepresented minorities start their education. I believe that the centering of those questions about equity, about income inequality, centering of those questions on four-year campuses gives such a huge opportunity to talk about what transfer students bring to the table. And so I see it as an incredibly bright future because those conversations can't exist without transfer being part of that equation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Archambault, for spending time with us this morning, sharing your expertise. It was a true honor to be able to hear from you. And thank you very much. I think we all got a lot out of your keynote. There were great questions that were shared, and I apologize that we couldn't get to all of them, but thank you. So the time is about 9:50, so we have about 10 minutes before our breakout sessions begin. So we want to make sure that you have plenty of time to take a quick break. I know this is a short conference today, but it is still a long time to be connected virtually for half a day. So take a break, grab some coffee, and then get ready to join one of our great breakout sessions. As a reminder, from 10 to 10:45 and then from 11 to 11:45, we will be presenting the breakout sessions. And again, you can access those using the COTA Conference Landing website. So you can see it on your screen. It will be entered into the chat, so you can copy and paste that. I will let you know that you do have to end the current WebEx that we're on before you can go into the next one. So once we break out of here, you can close that down and head back to the conference landing page. So just a reminder, you can see those sessions on your screen. So at 10 o'clock, you can choose from transfer course equivalency workflows, a perceptive content process, the demographic profile of the modern transfer student, and goodbye millennials, hello Generation Z. And then at 11 a.m., you can choose from the best practices, how statewide initiatives can strengthen institutions' transfer success, building workforce pipelines with the Bachelor of Applied Science degree, and building connections that transfer. Again, don't worry if you can't decide which one to pick. These are all going to be recorded and available on the conference landing site and the HEWD website. I will end it so you can leave this WebEx and take a quick break and then join us for our sessions here in 10 minutes. Thanks so much.